All right, hi. So the small book for big platforms is this comparative cross-country study that explores the potentials and perils of data ecologies for countries in Asia. And when we started, we kind of started looking at what could the books revolve around, right? And we came up with two specific questions. One was the idea of friction. We were very curious about what happens when we stumble across things that just don't quite fit. So, not necessarily taking a judgment call saying, oh, this is good or bad, or this is something that's working or not working, but essentially looking at what are the friction points when data ecosystems start unfolding in new geographies. That we know that this is happening, but we don't yet know how it is going to end. And the second one was to try and bring around a more nuanced understanding of what is a platform. Because we know that the platform is not a monolith, that it encompasses a multiplicity of practices. And in fact, that they look very different and have different histories in different parts of the world. The contributors to the two volumes that we have indeed taken up what I think is a heroic task, because they were supposed to give us depth and overview while still keeping the text short and within the prescribed word limit. And I must begin by thanking Kelly, Dave, and Smitha for doing precisely that. Because it's also given rise to some interesting challenges, right? Because the drafts, which are even now in an open peer review process, show how the contributors have taken up this challenge in their own unique ways. It's my pleasure to just briefly introduce, as editor of the series, the three contributors, and then I'm going to turn attention to them. So Kelly Kim, who from the South Korean context, talks us through the question of data ownership, privacy, consent, and future use. And she anchors the contribution in a very specific case study that looks at the longevity of data, right? And the lack of limitations on how data can and will be used as more applications evolve around them. Drawing from her own background as a lawyer and an activist, Kelly's piece is also a strong reminder, and this was really fun in conversations with her, that different parts of Asia have different temporalities, and that the majority language and the Northwestern focus of the internet often overlooks the fairly complex and long histories of technology development in countries like South Korea, who one might argue actually has better infrastructure than a large of so-called developed world when it comes to digital policies, regulations, and technology access. I think the reminder about high technology development and saturation is also resonant in Dave Lewis's ambitious reworking of the extraordinary work of Audrey Tang, who's one of the biggest open data proponents and activists from Taiwan. Anchoring the case in the current experience of the COVID-19 pandemic, Dave shows us how Taiwan was able to use its extraordinary open technology, open science, open data platforms to create a collective surveillance, a track and trace mechanism that has made Taiwan one of the most successful studies in pandemic management in the world. And at the same time, I think the piece shows that these things were not built while the world was burning, that tracking the histories of student movements, government investments, and the non-reliance on proprietary technologies, the piece kind of shows the long tail benefits of open science and open tech in particular, and the positive futures that they need or they have on platforms. And Smitha Prasad's piece from India, in fact, traces the messiness of what happens when data and technology platforms are built in the middle of the crisis. Focusing on health data and the platforms like Arogya Setu from India, which were developed on opaque data sets and contested biometric registration systems, I think Smitha's piece is a stark reminder of how data never exists in isolation. She charts for us the complex ecosystems of competing and complementary platforms, the contingencies that are built in technology policies and regulation, and the need for data to be put into intersectional contexts where multiple stakeholders are able to build collective and collaborative systems. So each of the contributors in this book kind of expands upon these data challenges and opportunities in the face of platformization by producing for me a clear set of touchstones. That data has to be thought of as embodied, as affective, as material, as political, as historical, and as for the commons. So it's my pleasure to invite Kelly, Dave, and Smitha to join the conversation. Your contributions are already up for open peer review, and each of you has about 5 to 7 minutes to just take us through the paper, highlight some of the best practices that have emerged, some of the challenges that you are facing through, and what we need to do when thinking about platform futures. And Kelly, we will begin with you.
Thank you, Nishant, for a very nice introduction. So I want to share my paper, which is in open peer review process. And so there might be some changes in the final small books. But okay. So I started my paper with brief introduction of South Korea's internet and platform history. And many of you watching this video might know that Korea is a country with world's #1 smartphone penetration rate, and is the next country to the US where local platforms thrive. So Naver against Google, KakaoTalk against WhatsApp, and Coupang against Amazon are like boasting overwhelming market shares. So in that sense, there's a big opportunities and challenges facing these platforms, especially in terms of data, because like platforms, they base their service on users' data. So the data opportunities and challenges faced by Korean platforms can be rephrased as the tension between data utilization and data protection. So because, as I already mentioned, data is essential for the production of products and services based on cutting-edge ICTs such as AI, big data, and cloud computing. And data utilization is at the core of the fourth industrial revolution policies and the Digital New Deal initiative of current President Moon Jae-in, who took office in 2017. So, but also Korea has a very rigid, very privacy infringing surveillance. Well, it wasn't supposed to be like surveillance system, but still we have like resident registration system, which is very similar to Aadhaar in India. So every citizen has a unique identification number from birth, and there are like mobile phone and the internet real name systems which mandates collecting of personal information, and also a culture insensitive to privacy infringement, which is very different from Western countries. So in response, Korea enacted the Personal Information Protection Act. And also we established the Personal Information Protection Commission in 2011, which is a few years earlier than the GDPR. And now, so Korea now has one of the strictest data protection regimes in the world. And so accordingly, there has been a tension between the industries, platform industries wanting to utilize data freely, and users and civil society concerned about privacy infringement, and the government trying to coordinate these different needs. So this conflict was particularly highlighted in the amendment process of 3 data laws in 2020, which focused more on data utilization than protection. So my paper then goes into those 3 data laws amendments. So 3 data laws amendment refers to the Personal Information Protection Act and the Act on Promotion of the Use of the Information Network and Information Protection Act, and the Credit Information Use and Protection Act. So these three laws were amended in 2020, and they focused on the utilization of data. So it has been very controversial, and of course, the civil society tried to fight back and push it back, but with no success. So nevertheless, so the bills passed National Assembly in January, and then it became effective from August last year. And the most important part of this three data law amendment was the introduction of pseudonymized information, which is also in the GDPR. And so pseudonymized information is personal information that has undergone pseudonymization and thereby becomes impossible to identify a particular person without the use or combination of additional information for restoring the information to its original state. That's definition of pseudonymized information. So this was introduced to make platforms and make companies easier to use personal information. And also this fourth industrial revolution and big data policies of the current government. And then I introduced those current government's policies. So the current government, Moon Jae-in president, proposed the fourth industrial revolution, leading the development of science and technology as a key economic strategy for policy tasks. And according to the strategy, the Ministry of Science and ICT was entrusted with the responsibility of building infrastructure and improving regulations for the fourth industrial revolution. And also he established the Presidential Committee on Fourth Industrial Revolution, and the strategy specified the facilitation of data opening and distribution as the main content. So these policies also focused on data utilization than data protection. So there was this friction point regarding data opportunities and challenges. So I represent as data utilization versus data protection. And this tension between utilization and protection was highlighted in this iruda case, which is AI chatbot. So this is iruda. So because the AI industry will benefit most from the three data law amendment, because the amendments made introduced the concept of pseudonymized information, and so the platforms can utilize. Okay, it's already 8 minutes. Sorry. Anyway, so this tension between data utilization and protection was culminated in this iruda case. So I introduced the iruda case here, and so the problem, data protection issues of iruda case were largely two problems. So first was like consent to data collection and processing, and second was like pseudonymization or de-identification of personal information that were used to develop this AI chatbot iruda. And I suggest some recommendations to solve, to deal with those issues. So that's how, so this was the gist of my paper. And I hope it would be very interesting and useful. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. I think that was really exciting. And no, it's okay if it took a little longer. I think in editing, we might figure out how to make it small. But I think this was a really good introduction on looking at it. I think we can quickly jump into Dave then. Dave, do you want to take us through the contribution that you've been authoring?
Thank you, Nishant, and thanks, Kelly, for that wonderful overview from South Korea. And as I mentioned, I'm going to be looking at Taiwan's response to COVID, but also looking at how Taiwan has used, a different approach to platforms, which I thought was very fascinating, and synthesizing a lot of the work that Audrey, who is the digital minister at the Executive Yuan at the central government of Taiwan, has been doing as a sort of focal point over the last couple of years in bringing the Taiwan government to work very closely with the very vibrant civic tech community in Taiwan, but also globally, and in trying to bring a more humanistic edge, a more collaborative edge, and a more community-centered edge to technology than I think what we tend to see in a lot of around the world. And I think to start off with, COVID is an interesting, I think, use case because, at the start of the pandemic, we had so many countries around the world, bring in data into their approaches. We had digital tracking for contact tracing. These debates happened around the world. Biosurveillance as a theme has become so common in our popular discourse, and yet Taiwan took this approach too, in the sense that it also saw data and technology as an important tool towards its pandemic containment efforts. However, rather than default to this kind of indiscriminate mass surveillance, the Taiwanese government and Audrey played such a critical role here is in turning to the community and looking at how, if you can bring tools and certain into the hands of the community, people can build solutions that you might not have thought of otherwise, and people can be more trusting in these solutions, and ultimately these lead to better outcomes. And one of the most interesting examples I thought was the building of a face mask platform, which now we're almost 2 years into the pandemic, and but at the start we all remember how scarce masks were, and this was such a critical item of both of people's basic safety and also society's efforts at large to contain the spread of the virus. And here I thought it was a very interesting example where in the beginning Taiwan struggled, so in early Jan and February struggled to get enough masks in people's hands. People were unsure about availability, and you had the same critical issues I think we saw around the world. But here you had a nice interaction where one of the engineers in Taiwan, he built an app on his own, which scraped whatever public data that was available to provide some sort of indicators for the public to understand where masks were and what the availability was. And very quickly that app went viral. It was a website, it went viral and almost crashed its servers. And here I think where you can see the nimbleness where Audrey and the Taiwanese government then came together and very quickly sort of provided the resources towards making sure this kind of data was available for everyone to use. And then you had a stream of people who came in, saw these data sets, and then built their own apps that, and here again, the power of the community and a sort of community-owned platform is you had people come in with different kinds of apps. So some people built line bots, some people built certain apps that were more catered to a disabled community. So really you had different use cases emerge, and rather than rely on one actor to set the boundary of what problem is, what the solution should look like, here you had the power of sort of releasing the data and having developers come and build, and then using APIs to make that possible. And so to very quickly sort of end this, I think it's really important, I think, to highlight how the Taiwan government and Audrey have seen how critical technology is but also understood that it needs to be designed in a way that's more community owned. And that can be a way to bring in people to participate in governance. And two platforms in particular that I think are worth noting, Taiwan and join.gov. And both these are similar platforms in the sense that they're not just groups of people who come together, but they're also designed in a way where people can provide answers, opinions on certain policy issues, and then using an underlying technology known as poll.is, which uses machine learning to provide sort of high-level actionable insights based on people's opinion to then really inform policy. And I mean, I think it's important to highlight here that Taiwan hasn't Taiwan is it's still building this technology, it's still building these processes. There's a lot of learning to be had both in Taiwan and also globally. But I think Taiwan has shown that it's possible to use technology to have people actually take part in a meaningful debate, and unlike what discourse on Twitter has become these days, and to offer a little bit of hope that people can take part in governance in a meaningful fashion. And people can have a say. And we've seen case studies in Taiwan over the status of Uber and how Uber was brought into the governance and regulatory structure in Taiwan, which was a great example of how this can be possible. And going forward, I mean, of course, Taiwan today is dealing with a second wave per se, and yet it's shown that for more than 12 to 16 months. Most of the island has been able to have a fairly normal life without lockdowns, without the sort of distrust in institutions that we've come to see in many countries today. And part of that success is building more civic tech platforms that are having people participate, that are built on transparency, that are built on open data. And I think this is an important starting point, it's an important touch point that I think countries around the world, but especially in Asia, can look to see how we can design communities and organizations using technology that can be more community owned. And I think this is an important conversation that I look forward to driving forward in this program.
Thanks a lot, Dave. I think one of the most interesting parts when it came out reading your contribution was that so much around platform data systems is conversations about interoperability. But what the Taiwan case study very clearly shows that it actually is about intersectionality. It's not about whether one platform will talk to another, but whether different communities will be able to talk to each other, or using the very complex and diverse set of programs which can be still put into place. So I think that switch within policy discourse is perhaps something that we also need to focus on going forward. But I also think there's a very close connection then to Smitha's piece that comes from India, because she is in fact charting out some of these problems in terms of what happens to communities, especially when thinking to health data and health platforms. So Smitha, maybe you can pick up from here.
Sure, Nishant, thank you. And thanks, Dave and Kelly, for those really insightful comments on what's happening in Taiwan and South Korea, respectively. So just getting into what's happened, the Indian context and the research that I did for this paper, when we look at, just referring back to what Nishant earlier said about the concept of frictions, as we look at the small books for big platforms. And if we think about the idea of data, the opportunities and challenges when we look at data, I think the frictions there come through in the theme itself. And especially when in the context of the current landscape of technological, regulatory, and policy growth in India, there's really a lot to be discussed on this topic, considering the number of new platforms that we have that are being locally developed in different, non-social media contexts, especially. So when we were discussing what themes to focus on while writing this piece in March and April of 2021, it seemed very obvious that COVID-19 and the digital public health response to COVID-19 was a good choice to focus on, considering that the Indian government, and both at the central and the state level, had picked up on so many different tools and platforms to respond to the pandemic, starting with the more famous contact tracing application at the central level, which is Arogya Setu, but also several smaller platforms at different levels of state government, local government levels, where they were trying to monitor quarantine enforcement, where they were trying to encourage telemedicine, which was previously regulated. Area where telemedicine, pharmacies, e-prescriptions, all of these kind of platforms were not really permitted or encouraged by the government. Even things like remote education, remote working, there were a lot of restrictions that were lifted as a result of the pandemic. But focusing specifically on the digital health solutions here, I think there was this. When we built these platforms to do contact tracing or quarantine enforcement, there was naturally a lot of data that was collected, a lot of personal information that was collected as a part of these of the functioning of these platforms, and there was a lot of controversy around that because while it's acceptable that for medical purposes you collect data, we also have to focus on the kind of background in which this data is being collected and used. And one of the more obvious issues here is that there is a lack of legal frameworks that backs these solutions in India. Although there is a strong recognition of a right to privacy by the courts, we have no comprehensive data protection regulation in the country. And at the same time, even when we look at our pandemic response, the broader laws that we've been using to respond to the pandemic are quite inadequate and dated, irrespective of whether you're looking at digital tools or not, actually. And the second, I think, more serious of the two issues really also is the question of access, that the reliance on tech solutions to respond to a pandemic in a country like India with such diverse levels of access to internet, access to technology, to smartphones, literacy, all of these issues kind of raises, right? And then there are several other aspects that were again discussed quite heavily in terms of the private sector involvement in building these technological platforms, but also if you look a little further into these issues, what happens next, what happens going forward, how do we build our public health response frameworks to be able to deal with something like this. And that's, I think, where it's really interesting to look at the context of the policy responses that we've seen developing over the past few years, pre-pandemic as well. So on the one hand, we've seen that India has worked with the WHO and worked with many actors locally as well as at the state government or central government level to build a detailed disease surveillance program for about 2 decades now. And a lot of this was not digital until about 2018 or so. And then we saw like a complete shift in how the digital response was undertaken, which really, on the face of it at least, doesn't seem to necessarily match up with the frameworks that were built over the past 2 decades. And then on the other hand, we see that this focus on digital solutions to respond to the pandemic comes at a time when the government has already been planning for a universal digital health program to feed into the Digital India program, which was has formed the core of many controversial features, such as the Aadhaar, the biometric national ID system, and has, more importantly, I think, raised several questions of data protection, privacy, and surveillance over the past many years. So I guess that's more about like the political context in which these responses were built. But of course, I don't think one paper can really address all of these questions, let alone even one question fully. So for the purpose of my research, I focused a little more on the collection and use of personal information and how our regulatory framework in that context can evolve to really adapt to what we've learned from the pandemic. Because it leads to many questions, including, first, whether the specific nature of digital responses that we've had are appropriate, considering the balance, I suppose, of the use of data versus the outcome that we've gotten from it, but also many bigger picture questions about public health research, private sector research that feeds into the public responses and things like that. So I think what stood out to me in the context of this research that I undertook was that this is a situation where we're not just centering data protection, but we're also centering the kinds of use of data that are required to adequately respond and adequately build public health infrastructure. So while we traditionally, when we look at data protection or privacy frameworks, we look at what is personal information, what are the subsets of personal information, for instance, health information as a type of sensitive personal information, and then say, okay, you can collect this data in XYZ situations, this is how you can use it, and then there are certain exceptions to whatever regulations we have. In this context, it seemed equally important to look at the use cases for data. These could form maybe exceptions if you're looking at a more comprehensive data protection law, or maybe like a subset of these regulations. But what stands out is that you potentially need the same sets of like basic data, but you need to account for the different, for whether you're treating an individual patient, for whether you're conducting research, scientific research on healthcare responses to a disease, or even research at a policy level on how to build public health infrastructure. And that brings in different stakeholders, different actors, different beneficiaries of all of this, these public infrastructure that you're building. So I think that's really the core learning and recommendation that comes out of this research. And it doesn't really necessarily provide all of the answers to the questions that are raised, but I think it provides an indication as to where the broader conversation needs to go and how much more granular we need to be when we're discussing recommendations on policy responses.
Thank you, all of you. This has been a really interesting experience for me as well, because I've, of course, been in conversation with each one of you about the different pieces, but also when you kind of bring it together. One of the things that is particularly striking to me is how none of you are actually resorting to what we would understand as the global jargon of big data problems. Because when you start looking at almost any conversation around big data or data politics and platforms, you're immediately thrown into this 7 V's of big data, like velocity, volume, veracity, variety, value, visualization, and variability, right? And it's really interesting that when we dig deep down into the both, even if this is just an overview, this is not the conversation we need to have. And I think that's one of the biggest recommendations we can start giving to policy actors and regulators, saying you need to stop thinking about data as this born digital thing which exists only in the digital matrix, that there is a possibility of perhaps starting to look at a completely different kind of a framework which understands data challenges as data politics, right? And so I was kind of making notes, and I'm realizing that what the 3 of you have given us, instead of the 7 V's of data, is perhaps the 5 vowels of data challenges, like the A-E-I-O-U of data, if possible. Because all of you touch upon A for access, particularly thinking about access to different kinds of communities, different kinds of demographies, but access not merely as this human device point of, oh, now you have a computer or a laptop or a tablet, and so you have access, but access as defined, in fact, through the regulatory landscape, right? Like what kind of access are we thinking about? What are the kinds of ownerships that come with that access and so on? I think the E is for ecosystems. I think this is something that needs to be emphasized over and over again, especially when thinking about platforms, because platform ecosystems in the contemporary discourse often talk about the ecosystem of the platform. So if you pick up something like Facebook, for example, you talk about all the different components and service providers which need to go into the ecosystem or the ecology that Facebook is building. But what all of you are showing is that the ecosystems within which platforms exist and different players within that need to be acknowledged in that. I think the I is perhaps for intention. the intention of the data, not just the production of it. And I think this is so particularly useful in all the three cases, if we are thinking about the ways in which data is going to be used in a chatbot in South Korea, but also that, when Dave is explaining ArtEZ's work in Taiwan, I mean, it's very clear that they are using the same techniques for data management that are often weaponized. Like the processes are the same for weaponization as well as for the affordances of data politics. Or if we look at Smitha's case study from India, where we realized that the intention with which specific kinds of data projects start and how their then application or deployment happens needs to be perhaps looked at more closely. The O would be for ownership. This is, I think, almost self-explanatory, that increasingly we are asking not only for data ownership, but also for perhaps data sovereignty, right? Your capacity to work with the data which you are giving to the platform as a point of negotiation, and having the capacity to continuously negotiate about the meaning, the context, the usability of that particular data set is something that's critical and needs to come into our conversations. And the last, perhaps the U will be around usage, because so much of the focus has been about how people use platforms, and perhaps we need to start thinking about how platforms use people. What are the ways in which the data that we give out is not just how data travels, but how data kind of extends our own selves, and the usage of data has direct material and embodied consequences on how we are. So I would want to kind of stop here saying we now have an OU of data. We don't have a full language, but at least we have the vowels as the building blocks to work on that. And I'm really grateful for the three of you to be sharing these conversations. The peer review process ends in another week, and then we are looking forward to the final publications out there and seeing how these conversations travel. So thank you very much for sharing your work for this accelerated research sprint. And yeah, let's look forward to what happens next.
Thank you so much, Nishant. Thank you all. It's been, you can read the papers, but I think actually hearing people verbalize them and knowing what they choose to focus on and highlight is always instructive. And it's been really great to hear all of you with your deep dives. And I know that when we started this project, when we wanted to think about platform futures and sort of ask big ticket questions and sort of be creative and use different imaginaries rather than the same old metaphors and tired old jargon, we didn't quite know what we would expect. We didn't know what case studies would appeal. We didn't know where people would want to do located studies. And we didn't know what lessons would emerge. But I think your insights into the spaces of possibility, the challenges, the barriers, give us so much food for thought. And I think this is phase one, where we're just chatting about these papers, which will culminate in publishing them into this small books series, where the first one is this one on data opportunities and challenges. The second one is on mobile ecosystems. We'll wait and see if there's enough interest to carry on with the phase two and pick other areas of platform governance and platform challenges in the Asia-Pacific region in particular. But I think a lot of your lessons have universal resonance. I think they show the diversity and breadth of the human plus machine experience of what it means to be digital in different contexts, what people's lived experiences look like. And I think governance must necessarily reflect the universal, the global, the local, the hyper-local, in Chinmayi's words. And I think we hope to unpack some of those ideas and contours through this project. So watch this space for all the other outputs that will emerge. So I'll end here by thanking Nishant, Kelly, Dave, and Smitha, and Bishaka, who joined us earlier for a really instructive afternoon. Thank you all and see you soon.